This stripper is in prison now, and the reason why is one of the coldest, most calculated stories you're ever going to hear. Her name is Mary Hart, and when this story starts, Mary is working the Phoenix Club circuit. And here's the thing about Mary. She is stunning. Dark hair, pale eyes, the kind of face that makes men forget they have a wallet. And Mary knows this. She's always known this, so she uses it. She dates well, she lives well, and she makes sure that every man in her life is worth something, financially speaking. But then she meets Richard. Now Richard is not wealthy. Richard is a quiet, steady accountant who drives a sensible car and brings lunch from home. And normally, Mary wouldn't give a man like Richard a second look. But Richard is persistent. Like, embarrassingly persistent. The man is absolutely devoted to her from day one. And Mary? She turns him down flat. Years pass. And then one day, Richard shows back up, except now he's running his own financial consulting firm and he's worth $1.2 million. And suddenly, Mary Hart is very interested. So they get married, they buy a house, they build a life. And for a while, it actually looks like a fairy tale. But Mary Hart doesn't do fairy tales. She does math. And one day, she sat down, ran the numbers on her marriage, and decided Richard was worth more to her dead than divorced. He came home early from a business trip one night. He never left. So let me tell you about Mary Hart before Richard. Before the house, before the freezer, before all of it. Mary grew up understanding one thing very clearly. That the world runs on attention, and attention runs on looks. And she had looks to spare. By her early 20s, she was working the Phoenix Club circuit and she was good at it. Not just the dancing, the reading. She could clock a man's net worth in about 45 seconds. The watch, the shoes, the way he held his drink. She knew which ones would spend and which ones would just stare. And she had absolutely no interest in the ones who would just stare. So Mary dated well. She kept her options open and her standards high, and she moved through Phoenix like a woman who had already decided she was the most valuable thing in any room she walked into. And honestly, she wasn't wrong. Then Richard Hart walks in. And Richard is fine. He's not a bad-looking guy. But he's not what Mary is used to. He's an accountant. Drives a used Honda. The kind of man who tips exactly 20% and means it as a compliment. And he is absolutely, completely, almost tragically devoted to Mary Hart from the moment he sees her. She turns him down, but here's what you need to know about Richard, and he doesn't disappear, he doesn't get his feelings hurt and move on like a sensible person. He just quietly decides that the problem isn't Mary. The problem is that he isn't enough yet, so he gets to work. Over the next few years, Richard Hart transforms himself. He leaves his accounting job and starts his own financial consulting firm. He builds a client list. He buys a house, an actual house, not an apartment, a house. In a good neighborhood, with a garage and a yard and enough square footage to signal to anyone paying attention that this man has arrived. And then, when he's ready, he finds Mary again. And Mary looks at the new Richard Hart, the firm, the house, the confidence that money quietly gives a man, and she says yes. They get married in the kind of ceremony that photographs well. And in the beginning, it is actually good. Richard is generous to a fault. He buys her a car, he takes her on trips. He tells her she never has to go back to the club if she doesn't want to, and she doesn't want to, so she doesn't. He gives her a life that looks from the outside like everything a person could want. And Mary, for a while, lets herself settle into it. They have dinners together, weekend routines, inside jokes. There are moments, real ones, where you could look at the two of them and think, this actually worked. The accountant who refused to give up and the dancer who finally said yes. It's almost a good story. But here's what Richard never understood about Mary Hart. Comfort, for her, was never the destination. Comfort was just what happened right before she started looking for the exit. She wasn't unhappy exactly. She just got full. The house was obtained. The car was in the driveway. The lifestyle was secured. And once Mary had everything she came for, the man who provided it stopped being a partner and started being furniture, present, unnoticed, in the way. Richard kept loving her the same way he always had, steadily, devotedly, without conditions. Mary had started doing a different kind of math. And that math had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with what happens to a woman's share of $1.2 million when a marriage ends in divorce court instead of a cemetery. 8 years in, Mary Hart has 2 boyfriends and a husband, and only one of them knows about the other 2. The first guy she meets at the gym. They start talking, then texting, then meeting up on afternoons when Richard is at the office. The second is someone from her past, an old connection she rekindled the way bored people do, quietly and without much justification. Neither of these men know about each other. Richard doesn't know about any of it. He comes home every evening, asks about her day, and believes whatever she tells him. Because Richard is the kind of man who trusts his wife. That's always been his fatal flaw. Mary, meanwhile, has already moved on in every way except legally. She's thought about divorce. Of course she has. She's not impulsive. That's the thing people would get wrong about her later. Mary Hart thinks things through. So she thought through the divorce. She ran the numbers. Arizona is a community property state, which means the house, the accounts, the firm's assets. All of it gets split down the middle. She'd walk away with maybe $600,000, a smaller place, and the need to rebuild from scratch in her 40s. And Mary Hart has no interest in rebuilding from scratch in her 40s. So she keeps thinking. She doesn't call a lawyer, doesn't confide in a friend, doesn't journal about it or lose sleep over the moral weight of where her mind is going. She just sits with the arithmetic, alone and very calm, until the arithmetic leads her somewhere most people's minds would refuse to go. If Richard dies, not divorces her, but dies, she gets everything. The house, the accounts, the life insurance. No split, no lawyers, no starting over. Just Mary Hart, widowed, sympathetic, and solvent. She doesn't decide all at once. It's more like a door she leaves open and keeps walking past until one day she realizes she's already through it. Richard, through all of this, is unchanged. He still comes home at the same time, still makes the same coffee in the morning, still reaches for her hand during movies like they're newlyweds. He has absolutely no idea that the woman sitting next to him has done a cost-benefit analysis on his existence and found him more valuable as a memory than a husband. Then the timeline moves up. Richard is supposed to be in Tucson for 3 days, client meetings, nothing unusual. Mary knows his schedule, she's counted on his schedule, but on the second night the meetings wrap early and Richard decides to drive home instead of staying over. He doesn't call ahead. Why would he? It's his house. He pulls into the garage just after dark. Mary is there. What happens next is the part that investigators would later describe in the kind of clinical, measured language that courtrooms require. A single shot, close range. Richard Hart, who spent years remaking himself into a man worthy of Mary's attention, who bought her a house and a car and a life, who never once stopped trusting her. He doesn't make it out of the garage. And Mary Hart stands in the silence afterward. And here is the part that will tell you everything you need to know about who she is. She doesn't panic. There are no shaking hands, no horrified second thoughts, no desperate phone calls. The woman who spent 20 years reading rooms and calculating odds simply looks at the situation in front of her and starts solving for the next problem. The body, the cover, the timeline. She had thought about this before. Not the exact night, not the exact moment, but the architecture of it, the logic of it. Richard just came home early and turned a plan into a reality. And Mary Hart got to work. The next morning, Mary Hart went shopping. Not in a frantic, covering her tracks kind of way. In a leisurely, I have a full day ahead kind of way. She browsed furniture. She looked at home decor. She stopped for lunch. To anyone watching, she was just a woman running errands on a weekday, completely unbothered, with nowhere urgent to be. Richard was in the chest freezer in the garage. This is the part of the story that tends to stop people cold, and not the crime itself, but what comes after. Because most people, if they did something like what Mary did, would fall apart. The guilt, the fear, the weight of it would crack them open within days. But Mary Hart appears to have experienced none of that. She moved through the following weeks with a composure that was, depending on how you look at it, either the sign of a brilliant criminal or something much darker than that. She kept the house running. She saw neighbors. She made plans with friends. She hosted a dinner, an actual sit-down dinner, while Richard's remains were sealed in the garage 30 feet away. She talked and laughed and refilled glasses and sent people home with leftovers. Weeks passed. Eventually, people started asking about Richard. Colleagues tried to reach him. Friends left messages. And Mary, when pressed, told a version of events that she'd clearly rehearsed. Richard had left. They'd been having problems. She didn't know exactly where he'd gone, but she wasn't surprised he'd taken off. She painted herself as a quietly wounded wife, abandoned, doing her best to hold things together. It was a convincing performance from a woman who had spent decades performing, but she waited too long to file the missing person report. That was the first crack. When she finally did file it, the delay was noticeable, the kind of gap that detectives write down and circle and come back to. Because a wife who believes her husband simply walked out doesn't call the police. A wife who needs a paper trail does. Detectives began asking questions, and Mary's timeline, smooth as it seemed on the surface, didn't hold up to pressure. The details shifted slightly between conversations. The emotional responses came a beat too late, or landed at the wrong moments. The investigators weren't convinced, but they didn't have a body, and without a body, they didn't have much. So Mary solved that problem too. She needed a death certificate to access the estate, and a death certificate requires a body, or at least enough of one. So she made a trip out to the desert east of Phoenix and left Richard's torso where she calculated it would eventually be found, remote enough to delay discovery, accessible enough to guarantee it. It was, in its own horrifying way, a logical move, the final transaction in a marriage she'd been quietly closing out for months. Hikers found the remains. The medical examiner confirmed it was Richard Hart, and what had been a missing persons case became a homicide investigation overnight. Detectives who had already been suspicious now had everything they needed to start pulling threads. They went back to the timeline, back to the finances, back to the hardware store, because that's where Mary Hart made her one mistake. In the days after the shooting, she had gone to a hardware store to buy a large plastic storage container, the kind used to hold the remains of a man before his wife figures out what to do with them. She paid cash. She thought cash meant anonymous. What she forgot, or perhaps never considered, was that she'd scanned her store loyalty card out of habit. The same card linked to her name, her address, her account. The camera above the register had logged the transaction. The loyalty card had confirmed who made it, and the container she'd purchased matched exactly what investigators needed to complete the picture. That was it. That was the thread. Mary Hart had managed the body, the cover story, the grieving widow act, the missing person report, the dump site, the death certificate play, all of it, methodically, alone. And she was undone by a points card she scanned without thinking on her way out of a hardware store. She was arrested, tried, convicted. The house went to the estate. The accounts were frozen. The carefully constructed life she had killed a man to protect evaporated in a courtroom in Phoenix on the day the jury came back. Mary Hart, who had spent her entire adult life making sure she always came out ahead, had finally run a calculation she couldn't win.